Titanic had enough lifeboats to satisfy the law. That is the most damning sentence in the episode. More than 2,200 people sailed. More than 1,500 died. The paperwork had an answer. The ship did not. The old rule measured tonnage brackets, not the number of people who might need to leave a giant liner at night, in cold water, under panic, and time pressure. Compliance became a sedative. It told institutions to stop asking whether the rescue system could actually rescue the people aboard. To understand the mismatch, start where the law wrote the smaller imagination into the rules. The rules in force came out of the older merchant shipping framework and life-saving appliance rules. By 1912, the highest bracket applied to ships over 10,000 tons. For that whole upper category, the requirement was 16 lifeboats, with capacity for 990 people. Titanic was not just over that threshold. Titanic was far beyond the world that threshold had been built to describe. The ship carried 16 lifeboats and 4 collapsibles. Depending on the source and method of counting, the total lifeboat capacity is usually given as 1,176 or 1,178 people. That was more than the rule required. It was not enough for the people aboard. More than 2,200 people sailed on Titanic. More than 1,500 died. The first layer of the failure is old rules governing a new ship. This can happen without anyone waking up one morning and deciding to be reckless. A regulation can stay in place because it once made sense. Then the world changes around it. Ships get larger. Business models change. Passenger loads change. Assumptions harden into forms. On paper, the rule is still active. In practice, it has become a record of an earlier risk. By 1912, that was the condition of the lifeboat rule. The table still had authority, but the table had stopped tracking the scale of the thing it claimed to govern. The second layer is the category ceiling. Once every very large ship falls into the same highest bracket, the bracket stops doing its job. A ship just over 10,000 tons and a ship many times larger can both be treated as members of the same legal class. The form still sorts them. It no longer measures them. That is why Titanic is a category failure, not just a failure of equipment count. The law did not say, count the people. It did not say, model the evacuation. It did not say, test whether the boats, davits, crew, and passengers could become a working rescue system at night, under stress, after a collision. It said the ship was in a bracket, and the bracket had become too blunt to protect the people inside it. This is the kind of failure that hides well, because it is administratively neat. A tonnage table looks objective. It is easy to inspect. It produces a number. A surveyor can compare the number to the ship, compare the ship to the rule, and move on. A people-based rule is harder. It asks about maximum occupancy, passenger movement, crew training, lifeboat loading, launch sequence, time, weather, list, panic, light, language, and access. It forces the institution to imagine the emergency as an event, not just a capacity line. That harder question was the right one, but the old rule had a simpler answer ready. 16 boats. Highest bracket. Requirement met. The third layer is the most dangerous one. Compliant became confused with sufficient. Titanic was not illegally under-equipped by the British rules then in force. That point matters because it removes the easy version of the story. The clean scandal is not that the ship simply ignored a known lifeboat requirement. The deeper scandal is that the requirement itself could be satisfied while leaving almost half the people aboard without a place in a boat. Compliance is not protection. It is only proof that a system met the questions the rulebook knew how to ask. The distinction matters because compliance has a special psychological power. It calms people. It lets institutions stop asking harder questions. It turns a minimum into a signal of adequacy. For Titanic, that signal was false. The fourth layer is physical. The ship could imagine more danger than the law required. The U.S. Senate report described Titanic as fitted with 16 sets of double-acting davits, the hardware used for lowering boats. Those davits were capable of handling more boats than Titanic carried. The ship carried 16 lifeboats and 4 collapsibles. The hardware, according to the report, could have handled as many as 48 boats. That is the visual hinge of the episode. The vessel itself had room in its design language for a larger emergency than the rule demanded. The rulebook was the smaller imagination. That does not mean the answer was only to stack the deck with more boats and declare the problem solved. The parliamentary debate after the sinking shows how complicated the question was. Members argued about boat height, launchability, crew training, watertight compartments, and the danger of treating lifeboat count as the only safety measure. But that complexity does not rescue the old rule. It makes the old rule look even weaker. A serious safety system would have had to think about capacity, launching, crew, drill, ship design, and passenger access together. The regulation had reduced that system to a table. There is a second reason the davit point matters. It shows that safety imagination was not absent from the ship entirely. The hardware did not prove Titanic was safe, but it did prove that a larger lifeboat plan was physically thinkable. The vessel was not constrained only by the category in the rulebook. That gap between what was thinkable and what was required is where institutional drift becomes visible. The system did not have to deny risk outright. It only had to accept a smaller version of the risk as the version that counted. Once that smaller version became official, everything else became optional. The fifth layer is the evacuation itself. Even the boats Titanic had were not fully translated into survival. The British commissioner later noted that Titanic's boat accommodation was used to less than 2/3 of its capacity. Crew training, launch procedures, passenger movement, class barriers, confusion, and the timing of the sinking all entered the event. This is where the episode has to stay disciplined. The lifeboat regulation failed. The evacuation also failed. They are connected, but they are not identical. One failure left too little capacity. The other failed to use even that capacity well. If we collapse those layers into one phrase, not enough lifeboats, we lose the mechanism. Titanic was not only short of boats. Titanic exposed a regulatory system that could certify a ship without proving the ship had a human-scale escape plan. The law had turned scale into a category. The ship turned that category back into bodies. In Parliament weeks after the sinking, the regulations were described as out of date. The debate moved beyond Titanic alone. It asked what the Board of Trade had allowed to persist, why the top end of the scale had not been extended, and how a fast-growing class of giant passenger ships had outrun the rules that still applied to them. There is an important restraint in that record. Some speakers warned against treating more boats as magic. They worried about whether boats could be launched from high decks in bad weather. They worried about whether crews had enough training. They worried about the construction of the ship itself. That makes the lesson sharper, not softer. A mature safety system does not pick one object and hope it carries the whole burden. It asks whether the pieces work together under the conditions where people will need them most. Titanic's legal regime did not do that. It let an old measurement stand in for a current one. Then the current one arrived. The collision did not create the mismatch. It revealed it. Before the iceberg, the gap lived in committee history, advisory assumptions, inspection practice, and a table that had not stretched with the ships. After the iceberg, the gap had a clock. That is the brutal part of old risk regulation. It can look stable for years because nothing has forced the measurement to prove itself. Then the proof arrives all at once. The rule is no longer a document. It is a capacity limit. It is a launch sequence. It is an empty place where a boat would have been. After Titanic, the institutional response moved toward a different frame. The British commissioner recommended that lifeboat and raft accommodation be based on the number of persons intended to be carried, not only on tonnage. The international response followed. In 1914, maritime nations adopted the first Safety of Life at Sea Convention, known as Solus, in response to the disaster. Solus did not undo Titanic. It did show what the old rule had failed to see. The question was no longer just, what class of ship is this? The question had to become, what happens to the people on board when the ship becomes a place they must leave? That is the part of Titanic the legend often flattens. The iceberg was real. The confidence was real. The speed, the warnings, the night, the water, the chaos, all real. But the paperwork was real too. And the paperwork matters because it shows a system failing before the collision. The failure was already present in the table. It was present in the top bracket. It was present in the belief that a category built for yesterday's ship could still certify tomorrow's. That is why the opening sentence matters. Titanic had enough lifeboats to satisfy the law. The law had stopped measuring the ships it was approving. That is how an institution can be wrong while every form is filled out correctly. The form asks the old question. The world has moved on. The answer comes back compliant. Then reality audits the system. Titanic did not just hit an iceberg. It hit a regulatory world that had stopped measuring the ships it was approving. The failure was real. The cause chain was longer. The legend fades. The receipts remain.
Specificity and rank define the order, but fragile architecture can't hold water. It's a cascade of forgotten code. A heavy legacy begins to overload.